Welcome, everybody, to the fourth episode of the NSPKU podcast. My name's Tom. I am an adult with PKU. I'm 33 and I'm on 8 exchanges. What we have today is a podcast all about genetic counselling, which I don't really know too much about. So we're going to learn as we go through this. This is a platform purely hosted by the NSPKU, just to shine on different topics within the PKU space. And today's topic or person that we're talking to is Emily. So if you'd like to introduce yourself, Emily, and kind of what's your connection or why are you working in the area of PKU?
Thank you, Tom. So I'm Emily Fee, which I've just realised is quite ironic, isn't it? Because of but not spelt the same way as Fee. And I am a third year master's student in genetic counselling. So I came to studying genetics a bit later in life because of my own family's experiences. Um, and I first got in contact with the NSPKU a couple of years ago, which was when I wanted to kind of get some insights from the community for a presentation that I was doing, which ended up being about the need for a more patient-centered service, particularly for adults with PKU. So that's really where I've sort of been on my journey learning about PKU. And I think PKU is a very unique condition in a lot of ways. So it's what's considered a treatable condition, but I think that word treatable doesn't cover the kind of the breadth and the depth of experience associated with needing to stay on the diet. And I think, things that I've learned, for example, I've heard on a previous podcast about, it's not always easy to just up your exchanges if you're told that you can do that, or perhaps if you have access to different foods, it's not always so straightforward to just start having those when you never have before. And because in genetic counselling, what we really want to do is try and see the world as much as possible from the eyes of somebody with a condition. And so having those kind of insights is really helpful. And I think will probably will help shape my sort of future practice, really. That's me.
So in terms of genetic counselling, what is that? I am a person just with PKU. I have no idea. I teach, I do filmmaking. I've got nothing scientific in me. What is genetic counselling in a nutshell?
Well, I was wondering, Tom, not to put you on the spot too much, but just
Yeah.
what would you've said you don't know much about it, but what would your initial perception be of what it might involve?
Oh, okay. So I think I weirdly I associate counselling with like therapy and almost getting a bit more comfortable and knowledgeable about yourself. But so I guess that kind of works. And the genetic side of me, when it comes to PKU, is obviously my genes. I've got two from my mum and my dad that go into this. So I guess at a base level, not to feel like I'm just repeating what genetic counselling is by going, it's the counselling of genetics. Um, I don't know. I think it's obviously focusing your eye or your lens of your life onto your genetics and kind of how do you process that or understand a bit more about yourself. That is probably the least scientific answer that you've probably had of what genetic counselling is, but that's what I thought it was. What's your definition then, Emily, of being a genetic counsellor?
Well, do you know, this is really hard, and I actually spent some time Googling this yesterday. What is genetic counselling? Which seems a bit ridiculous because I've spent years now working towards this qualification because I had to do some science education before applying for the course and so on. Um, and I think what I would say is it's probably really a dialogue between the person that's in the clinic room and the genetic counsellor. So there is the element of delivering what can sometimes be really complex genetic information. But it's much more than giving information. It's more about finding out with that person what that information means to them in the context of their own life, possibly in the context of future choices, and really working kind of together to see how they might best move forwards in a way for them. So we might see people at all kinds of different life stages. It could be perhaps someone that's found out about a family history of a condition and they want to understand what the chances are of them having the same condition. They might want to know what testing's available and whether that testing is right for them or whether it's right for them right now. People might also have just received a diagnosis, or they might have received a diagnosis for a child, and they're wondering about adjustment to that diagnosis. They might be wondering about how to talk to family about the condition, because families can be really, really complex, and sometimes communicating genetic information can be a really difficult thing to go about navigating. So genetic counsellors are trained in both the science, the molecular sort of science that underpins the genetics that we talk about, but also in counselling skills. So that's skills that might help facilitate decision making, or helping to find healthy coping strategies, or helping to facilitate communication. So there's lots of different kind of skills that are going on to kind of support that relationship, really.
So obviously you've mentioned there about facilitating, like how, in a base layman, how collaborative is it? Is it a case of a genetic counselor going, I advise you to do this with this diagnosis, or is it led by the patient in terms of what they're interested in, where they want to go with that? How collaborative is it?
Thank you. It's a really good question. So a sort of central ethos of genetic counselling is that it's considered non-directive. I will put a caveat on that and say that if, for example, there was something like a cardiac condition or a inherited cancer condition where screening might be really helpful to that person, then probably we would say that actually we would advise you to have that screening. But beyond that, it really is a non-directive collaborative process as much as it's possible to be. So we really are looking to help people to find the best way forwards for them, and that can look really different for different people. It can look different for different members of the same family, and sometimes that can look really different from what they came into the clinic room thinking would be the right choice for them, for example, if it involves a choice. So genetic counselling appointments tend to be around 45 minutes. Sometimes they can be longer. And that's really a space for that person, with the support of the genetic counsellor, to understand the information in the context of their own choices. So genetic counsellors aren't telling people this is what you should be doing with that information, with the caveat that I've mentioned. But generally speaking, the right decision for a person is not something that we can be a judge of. It's something that we can help people to find for themselves.
No, I think that's really reassuring, and it's nice to hear that it is kind of a far more collaborative experience, because I think once you get to, say, adult clinic, it's a lot more like it should be a lot more. I'm leading my life is completely different to X, Y, Z person with PKU, and it's almost like whatever my personal circumstances are, I should be the one helping direct where we go with that information. So it's good to hear that that's the case.
I think that was something that was really interesting to sort of learn from the PKU community was, what's their experience of going into clinic, um, and that's really, it is what genetic counsellors really want to do, is understand that experience, and see it, walk for. I think there's a quote about walking for a moment in someone else's shoes, and that's what we're trying to do in a genetic counselling appointment. It's not necessarily a sort of ongoing sort of therapeutic alliance over a period of time. Sometimes there might be a series of appointments depending on what the circumstances are. So, for example, with some conditions like Huntington's disease, there's a sort of a process which has happened, but outside of that, it might just be a one-off encounter that you have with a genetic counsellor, which could be a time that it might not feel relevant to you at one point, but actually at a later point, you might think, do you know what, actually, it would be really nice to see if I can get that referral to genetic counselling, because there's some things that have come up that I'd like to talk about that I hadn't really thought about before, for example.
So we obviously have a variety of different things, like variety of different people that could watch this podcast. So you could have families, you could have people like myself that have the condition themselves, or family members that haven't directly contributed to the child genetically, but have heard, oh, it's obviously come from a mum and a dad, and then they've become PKU because of these things. So when we talk about genetics, there's a fair few people to talk about, isn't there, in a sense? There's the people that are directly affected, aka myself, and the wider network, as you were saying. So I guess in kind of really simple layman's terms, is it what am I classed as? What's a family that's contributed genetically to me classed as in a genetics kind of way, if that makes sense?
Yeah, so you're asking about how it would be described in a kind of in a clinical sense?
Yeah, I think because I know myself as I've got two, things that don't break down this, and this is what leads to me having PKU, and that could be the most unscientific answer you could have, but I know that sometimes families find it quite surprising that it's come from themselves and they've lived for their entire life without knowing it, if that makes sense. And that's kind of what this genetic counselling is kind of unpick, isn't it, in a sense? So, what a base level of genetics is it carriers of families that people are known as and that sort of thing. So I guess just as an intro to what genetics is.
Yeah, sure. It might be helpful to sort of talk about what we mean by genes. So the instructions that our bodies use to grow and function are contained in a chemical message called DNA, which lots of people are familiar with. And sections of that DNA are called genes, and genes have a particular job in the body. So each gene is responsible for producing a particular building block called a protein. And the PAH gene that's associated with PKU is responsible for the enzyme that helps to break down phenylalanine. PKU is what we call an autosomal recessive condition. And this is where you're hearing terms about, for example, being a carrier of a condition. So we have two copies of most of our genes, one from each parent. And in PKU, both copies of that gene need to have a change on them that disrupts the gene from working in order to become affected by PKU, to be a person that has PKU. We've all got lots of changes in our genetic code between us, but sometimes those changes disrupt the function of a gene, and that's what happens in PKU. So in order to have the condition, you would receive a changed copy from each parent in most circumstances. Occasionally a change can start for someone for the first time, but most of the time you're receiving a changed copy from one parent and from the other parent. So each of those parents will have a changed copy, but because their other copy of the gene is doing the job, they won't have any sort of clinical symptoms, and that's what we would call a carrier of the condition.
And is there like, I know that different countries have like different prevalences within the condition of like one in X amount of people. Is there a pattern of who gets the condition to a degree, or as people I know, like for background context, I think I've been told that because my surname is Ukrainian, I have some Eastern European strand of the PKU condition that's a bit different than, I don't know, I grew up in Nuneaton and Wolverhampton, so it's probably not that strand, it's that. So is there a pattern of inheritance? Is there an idea of like these people get it a little bit more frequently, or is this kind of part of the genetic counselling kind of understanding, can we actually see who are carriers now? Because they didn't used to be, I think, when I was growing up, you didn't really necessarily know about other people that were just looking normal but could carry the condition. I don't know if that makes any sense, Emily.
It does, yeah. So there's a couple of things there. One of the things that I should mention is that changes in genetic code can have different kinds of effects. If you imagine it a bit like a sentence, if you change different letters in a sentence, could change the way the sentence reads. And it's also kind of a little bit like a recipe. So if you change one ingredient, you might get one effect. And if you change a different one, you might get a different effect. And that's part of why genetic testing can be done as part of the CUVAN sort of responsiveness protocol, because it can give some indication based on what the spelling change is, of what effect that's actually having, and that's also associated, of course, with whether you have classical PKU and the kind of the exchanges you might be on in any case, aside from treatment. Now, you've asked about different populations, and there are different carrier frequencies in different populations. So yes, in, for example, European population, I think the carrier frequency is what we say 1 in 50, but that can be quite different in other populations where there is a higher amount. There's a higher number of people with PKU. Carrier testing can be available via genetic testing, via genetic counselling. It's something that people could access via a GP referral if they wanted to talk through with a genetic counsellor what this information means in the context of their own family, their own circumstances, and what they would kind of want the information to help them understand.
No, I think that's really interesting, because I think that boils into the knowing more about yourself, isn't it? And knowing more about what's going on around you, in a sense. So we've kind of covered, or you quizzed me on what genetic counselling is. So where can I find a genetic counsellor in the process of, is it within clinics? You obviously just said about GP referrals sort of thing. Where typically would I be able to find a genetic counsellor within my support network of PKU?
Yeah, it's interesting actually, because this is very anecdotal, but the genetic counsellors I've spoken to haven't seen that many PKU families in clinic, and I'd be interested to kind of know whether that's because people feel like it's perhaps not relevant to them. It's worth knowing that it's something that you could potentially access at whatever time it sort of felt relevant to you. So it wouldn't necessarily be a sort of ongoing process. It might be a sort of one-off encounter that you wanted to talk through something that's come up. And that could be at different life stages. So it could be a family that have just received a diagnosis and they're kind of adjusting to looking after a child with PKU, and perhaps adjusting to knowing that they were carriers and that they passed the condition onto the child. There can sometimes be a lot of quite complex feelings around that. And so that can be a really good time to talk through that with a genetic counsellor and kind of work out a way forward together, in terms of how that might be processed and how you'll kind of move forwards from it. Perhaps someone that's got PKU later in life wants to revisit the genetics of it, would like to find out a little bit more information about it, perhaps contextualise that against what future choices they have, or talk about it with a partner. There's lots of points at which genetic counselling could be helpful for someone, and it's normally something that would be accessed via a GP, unless the metabolic clinics have a referral route. So that's probably something worth finding out.
Yeah, so there's two different possible routes there, isn't there? And I agree. I think if you were given information about yourself, I see it in the students that I teach at university when they say you get like an autism diagnosis. There's a whole development post the diagnosis of what do you do with that information? How does that affect your decisions in life or your day to day? And I think, that's going to be exactly the same when you know a little bit more about your own genetics, which is fundamentally going to get you to question things, or, be, oh, great, it's a reassurance. I wasn't thinking about it in that way. So brings us on to your dissertation and your kind of, your big research project that you've probably read more about PKU than I have. So what is this project? How can people get involved? What would you require? And kind of, I guess you've been doing it for a certain amount of time so far. So I'm not asking for findings, because I hate asking people for findings of research projects that haven't been finished yet.
I don't think I can tell you yet anyway.
Exactly. But kind of, I guess, what the original motivation was for the research project, and then kind of maybe how it's developed over that period of time. But first of all, tell us about the project.
Yeah, thank you. So really, I'm just wanting to explore how the perspectives of people with PKU could help shape future resources about having children. So I think there's real seeds of change that are being seen where there's starting to be a real drive to produce things that have got the patient voice at the heart. And I think the best way of doing that, and I think this has been found in research as well, is to really involve people in the people that the resources are for right from the beginning. Um, so I'm hoping that talking to people a bit more about their experiences of living with PKU, what their perceptions are about having children, which for women can include the experience of thinking about maternal PKU and how that might fit in with their lives, with conversations with their partners, and how this might kind of guide what sort of information people would actually find helpful in resources, and also what sort of resources people might want and how we could go about providing those. So all adults with PKU are eligible if they can communicate in written and spoken English. That could be people with children already. It could be people that are considering it one day, or maybe they're not sure. And I'm really interested in hearing different perspectives. I can only do that if I have participants. So I'd be really interested in hearing from people in the community. They just need to email me. I'm sure that Tom, you can put my email address at the bottom of the blog post. And if they've got any questions about whether they feel it's relevant to them, they're welcome to ask. I'm always happy to, to talk a little bit more about what the research is. But it's quite open. As I say, it's really driven by the insights I'm hearing from people. And that will hopefully guide what resources could look like. So I hope that makes sense.
No, that does make sense, and I think it's nice to hear that obviously patients are guiding the documents or the guidance that's actually going to help them going down the line. And I think the interesting thing, I guess, to reiterate is even though it is about necessarily, going to have children or something like that as the outcome, it's that, well, I think a lot of us will probably bring how we've lived with the condition into how we perceived the condition, then put onto someone else, isn't it? So I think that's a really interesting perspective that you probably could talk to 100 people with PKU and we all have completely different outlooks or philosophies or coping mechanisms or not coping mechanisms with the condition, and that's all then going to impact how that piece of information is then disseminated down to the person, sort of thing. So I guess not that this is not part of your study, but is there any questions for you from me? I guess I am PKU person in front of you. What sort of, if people could get an idea of what sort of questions might be being asked within the studies, then that could kind of reassure them, couldn't it?
Yeah, of course. I mean, I would probably start out, Tom, by just kind of asking a bit about what your experience of living with PKU has been.
Yeah.
Um,
Okay. So I think if you got me at different ages, probably my experience with the conditions has shifted. So the 33-year-old version of me is quite positive. I'm quite open to talk about the condition with everybody, hence why I'm on a podcast. So I think it's quite obvious. But everybody that I work with, everybody that's around me knows about it, and I think I've kind of just accepted the restrictions that come with that via the food, diet, etc. I'm a bit of a planner. I've got autism, so I like a little bit of a plan. So I think that probably helps me about sticking to rules and diets and all this sort of stuff. But yeah, I've got 8 exchanges, so I can't go randomly binging on any form of products. But in terms of living day to day with it, there are more difficult parts. That's probably a bit more the logistical side of things, like prescriptions and that sort of stuff that annoy me more. But I always have the philosophy that I think there's worse things that I could have out there. In a way, I always use the nut allergy as an equivalent because that that would, or diabetes, those two terrify me more than PKU does. So I think that's probably in a real small nutshell my experience with the condition. But I think if you spoke to me in teenage, oh, I was probably thinking it was not the greatest thing to have. I wanted more chips and all this sort of stuff. The problems escalate and change depending on the age. But at the moment, I'm okay with it, I think.
I think that's a really interesting point about different stages, and I think that's also really important when we're thinking about resources and things like that, because that's something that's available to people, and hopefully can reach them at whatever life stage they're at, and this can help them sort of start with thinking about their own lives and decisions.
Yeah, I think eventually it would be nice to see, like, I've always found this very strange with this is sidetracking, but strange with the adult clinic side of things, because you have child clinic for 0 to 18 years, and then if I live to 78, 60 years of my life with that adult clinic sort of thing, which there's so many resources at the child stage, which I kind of get, you've got to establish good practices. But then me at the age of 33 is, and thinking, about, kids, marriage, that sort of thing, compare me to 55. Hopefully all that thing's aligned and sorted and that sort of stuff. Like, it is not a one size fits all, that we can't guarantee someone at a certain age is going through a certain thing. Whereas I think as a child, there's almost a little bit more of a, well, you're a teenage. That's what happens in teenage. Scientifically, this is what happens. So I think it's really interesting because there's such a wider spectrum, isn't there? I think that's going to be really interesting with your research area of, like, depending on what age and maturity you come to decide to maybe have a child, depends on your impact on how you've thought about the condition, or how much more longer of a life you've got. Or, yeah, it's weird. It's an interesting thought that I've just thought out aloud in front of you, Emily. So enjoy that.
I think you're also very right though about people's experiences being so different, and that can be within a family as well. I've been on clinical placement, and I've seen how different a shared experience, whether that's of a condition or a family member having a condition, can be depending on where someone's coming from. And as I say, that can be within the same family.
Yeah.
In a genetic counselling appointment, so much comes through sometimes, even when you're just taking a family history. So at the beginning, we'll take a family history, and some things on there might be nothing to do with genetics. It could be to do with a tragic incident that's happened, or perhaps a member of the family that no one's speaking to because of something else that's happened. There's so much going on in people's lives, and I think a lot of the time that can come together in a way that people don't always aren't necessarily completely aware of. And sometimes, at key points like having children, or receiving a genetic diagnosis or anything like that, it can all sometimes really come together in this kind of this way of how people experience their lives.
Yeah, I think that's kind of is like the uncovering of your existence, isn't it? In a weird way. Like, so yeah, it's very interesting. I think the the premise of working out what links to what, and then what do you do with that information, I think is really quite interesting. And this is why you said it's about when you feel like you're able to come to it. It's not well, at the age of 20, every person meets with this person. That probably won't work. It's that, you know, whenever people feel comfortable for that. And in a weird way, actually, when I think about possibly having a child, is, well, then the child is the thing that I spend the most attention on, not my PKU and dealing with the PKU. And I think that's kind of, I know a lot of people that have gone through maternal PKU and been mums with PKU, that necessarily the juggling act of looking after yourself to then look after the child is even more things to think about. So it's yeah, I think it's a very interesting, very untapped area. So it'd be very interesting to see how the research has come out. So yeah, as we said, underneath the video there'll be contact information for Emily, so people can contact.
Yeah, to reassure you as well, because you've asked about what kind of questions might come up, and don't worry, you're not gonna be put too much on the spot. And people don't have to, you don't have to answer all the questions either.
Yeah,
It's
yeah,
just
yeah, yeah.
really it's really a conversation with me, which should probably take about an hour. But you know what? If it doesn't take an hour, that's fine too. Anything that people want to share is valuable.
Mhm.
So there would be questions around, for example, as I said, your experience in life with PKU, maybe how that has come up in conversations, if at all, with a
Mhm.
partner, um, what your kind of understanding and perceptions are about the inheritance, whether that factors together with it at all, and also what kind of information and support needs you feel that people with PKU have, particularly in this context. But it's also helpful to know what sort of things have you found helpful in resources before, even if it's about a different subject, that can sometimes kind of inform what might be helpful in a different context as well. So there's been lots of really interesting things coming up already so far. So I'm really, yeah, really interested to hear what others have got to share.
Yeah, I think it's just useful sometimes, I think, because there's so many different areas that you could talk about with PKU that it's like, what are you interested in with this? And I think that's where quite a lot of the community would be good to know, like happy to know about where the general chats are, because I think for some people we are very open about talking about it, and for other people it is a oh, I talk about it if I have to, sort of thing. And I think having actually both perspectives that contribute towards this research area is what we need, because then that gives a wider patient voice as opposed to just whoever is the most eager to talk about things and they're the ones being catered for. Because in a way, it's the ones that are kind of off the grid or the ones that are a bit more not tapping into the services as much as they could be. They're the ones that probably need more support than anybody in a sense, because that's there'd be loads of other complicated issues that come with that as opposed to the ones that are so openly out there and talking about it anyway. But yeah, no, thank you for your time, Emily. It's been a really good chat, and I think I've certainly learned a lot more about genetic counselling, and kind of just really interested to know yeah, whenever you feel ready to, getting to know a bit more about where what I've got in a sense, which I think is really quite interesting. And I think as science develops, that's what we're always kind of interested in knowing a little bit more about. So no, thank you for your time, Emily. Is there anything else that you'd like to add that we haven't felt like we've chatted about?
I don't know really. I think you were just saying about science advancing. I think the NHS 10-year plan is that I think by 2035, 50% of healthcare interactions will have some element of genomic information informing them. So it
Oh
really is
wow, okay.
um, I think it's a field that people will come more and more in contact with one way or
Mm,
another. And of course, genetic counselors are kind of are there to talk to people as and when information is relevant and helpful to them.
yeah, no, that's really I didn't know that, and that's really interesting to know because I think we all don't know what our futures look like with this condition because it's quite an early condition as opposed to history with other ones, sort of thing. So I think the more that people can know about things, the better, because we're all shaping whatever that future looks like. So, yeah, that's really interesting. So, thank you for your time, Emily. If anybody wants to get involved with the study, then obviously it'll be down below. And if you want any more topics or guests that you want to appear on the upcoming podcast, do let us know in comments or contacting the NSPKU. As we've kind of said, this is just me and Emily having a chat. The NSPKU provide this platform for us to shine lights on things. We are not saying that everything we are talking about is categorically golden. We are a standard of everything. We are just having chats about things, but we want to kind of give these platforms to areas that are more developing within the PKU space. So thank you, Emily, for your time, and I hope you have a good rest of the day. And thanks everybody for listening or watching.
Oh,
Bye.
thank you very much for including me. Bye.